Goedemorgen iedereen, bienvenue tout le monde. Good morning everyone. And welcome, thank you for joining. My name is Marianne Blondeel and I work here at the UN United Nations Regional Information Center. I'm the Communications Officer for the United Nations in the Benelux countries. And I'm here today with two members of the United Nations International Independent Expert Mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in law enforcement. Dr. Tracie Keesee and Victor Rodriguez. Both are appointed by the President of the UN Human Rights Council to serve as independent experts of this mechanism. Dr. Tracie Keesee served for 25 years in the Denver Police Department and then in the New York City Police Department. She's currently an associate professor of public safety and justice at the University of Virginia, and she's also co-founder of the Center for Policing Equity, which promotes police transparency and accountability. And Mr. Victor Rodriguez, he is the president of the Center for Civil and Political Rights in Geneva, Switzerland, and also of the International Institute for Social Responsibility and Human Rights in San Jose, Costa Rica. He's also a member of the General Assembly for the Inter-American Institute for Human Rights and of the Assembly of the International Commission of Jurists. He's a visiting professor at various universities, including Colonial University. Both experts just finished their visit to Belgium. I've been told it's been a visit of 12 days, quite intense, and it's the first time this mechanism visits Belgium, and it was created in 2021 by the Human Rights Council, and we're here today to listen to their findings about their visit. The briefing today will be on the record, and it will take about 1 hour, which will include a presentation by both experts, and then afterwards we will have a Q&A. Can I already kindly ask you that during the Q&A you introduce yourself and you mention which outlet you work for. The briefing will entail details of the visits, the places they visited, authorities they met with, the concerns they found, good practices they encountered, any preliminary recommendations they have, and the next steps. So with that, thank you for being with us today, Dr. Keesee and Mr. Rodriguez. I will hand over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. I'm hoping everyone can hear me fairly well. As stated, I'm Dr. Tracie Keesee, and I'm one of 3 of the United Nations International Independent Expert Mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement. And our charge is specifically examining those of African and African descent. First, we'd like to thank the government of Belgium for its invitation to visit the country and for its cooperation before and during the visit. The expert mechanism particularly appreciates the support of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the smooth cooperation in arranging most of the programmatic work in regards to institutional and local meetings. The expert mechanism also likes to thank all of the government and local officials who met, who generously answered our questions and shared data, presentations, references, reports, and other materials during our visit. During these past days, the mechanism also met with various civil society representatives and heard testimonies of affected communities and individuals. The expert mechanism would like to thank all the persons it met, including people of African descent, human rights defenders, lawyers, academics, community members, and all affected individuals for their bravery and generosity in sharing their experiences and stories with us. We would like to stress that the views expressed in this statement are of a preliminary nature. The expert mechanism received different submissions from various entities and is still waiting to receive more written information from all the stakeholders it met. All of the information received will be studied by the mechanism, and a final report with findings and recommendations will be presented to the United Nations Human Rights Council in September, and will also make it publicly available on the mechanism's webpage. During this mission, the expert mechanism visited Brussels, Namur, Charleroi, Antwerp, and Mechelen. In Brussels, we met with the Minister of Consumer Protection, Social Fraud, and Prevention, Persons with Disabilities and Equal Opportunities, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Justice, the High Council of the Judiciary, the Flanders and Brussels regions, the Mayor of the City of Brussels, the Standing Commission of the Local Police, Committee P, and the General Inspector of the Federal and Local Police. We also met with local police zones in Paul Brou and Brou West, and UNIA, the Flemish Institute of Human Rights, and Federal Institute of Human Rights. The mechanism also visited the Detention Center of Migrants in Caricol and the Museum of Central Africa in Germany. In Namur, the mechanism met with the Walloon region and the French community and visited the prison of Namur. In Charleroi, we met with the local government and with the police. And in Antwerp, we met with the police and the city of Antwerp. And finally, in Mechelen, the mechanism visited Keesee, Wilson, the Holocaust Museum. And I will stop here and pass it to my colleague, Victor.
Thank you very much, Tracie. I'm Victor Rodriguez. I want to start with fact-finding, and starting with the general fact and then specific. Systemic racism. In Belgium, as in many other countries around the world, racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance against migrants, persons belonging to minorities, including people of African descent, and in general against persons perceived as foreigners based on their ethnic, religious, or linguistic profile, are present. Existing in society, these racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance permeate into the law enforcement bodies. There is no explicit acknowledgement from authorities of the existence of systemic or structural racism, even when they refer to different cases. Worryingly, we heard that some authorities explicitly denied its existence or even amplified voices of racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance. With all information received so far in these 10 days of visit, we live with this preliminary conclusion. Systemic racism against African people and people of African descent exists in Belgium. This is a structural issue that requires a structural response. Systemic racism and racial discrimination manifest in various aspects of society, including structural barriers that hinder equal access to employment, education, healthcare, and housing. Colonialisms. Systemic racism against African and people of African descent is a legacy of enslavement and colonialism. Belgium needs to continue to put efforts in facing its colonial past towards reparatory justice. The scars of colonialism are still present. The consequences are here with us today, not only in Africa, but on the Belgian territory. We heard of some good initiatives of facing Belgian colonial past, including, for example, in public spaces concerning status, monuments, street names, etc. We welcome the initiative of several federal and local authorities designating special departments or officers against discriminations placed in different regions and cities across the country. We document the creation of a new human rights and equality body for Flanders. We learned that it already has the resources to operate, but we know some institutional shortcomings. For example, that the new institute doesn't have the powers to go to court on specific cases or to obligate authorities to give information or to enforce its recommendations. We have also heard about the initiative to disappear Union and the reduction of its budget. We want to stress that equality bodies need to be independent and well-resourced. Belgium needs to take the necessary measures to ensure its independence and effectiveness with the allocation of adequate legal tools and resources for implementation of their mandates. Disaggregate that we understand the legislation forbids the collection of personal data that reveals a person's race or ethnic origin, which leads to a lack of comprehensive disaggregated data throughout the entire institution framework, including interactions with law enforcement and the justice system. Disaggregated data is the ultimate evidence with which structural, institutional, and systematic or systemic racism can be revealed and analyzed to combat it. Its absence prevents the state from devising policy mechanisms to recognize problems, prevent violation, and encourage more cooperation. People of African descent, including Belgians of African descent, are being erased from the statistics. In the absence of disaggregated data, the differentiated impacts they suffer are being institutionally denied. We heard of some initiatives to try to reverse this problem, including by and mostly collecting data. We also heard about a federal project to establish a permanent equality data platform. This project needs to be expanded and strengthened. The systematic collection of disaggregated data is necessary not only to assess level of discrimination and progress, but to ensure diversity, inclusion, and equitable representation in all sectors, including in public institutions. In this sense, we are particularly concerned by the lack of representation of minorities, including persons of African descent in public services sectors, including the judiciary and law enforcement agencies. Action plans against racism. We documented that in some regions, local authorities have made efforts to develop action plans to combat racism. For example, Wallonia, the French community, and Brussels capital region, but not the Flemish and German communities. However, there is no similar action plan in the interfederal level. Belgium played an important role in the processes of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action 25 years ago. The implementation of a national plan against racism is the major recommendation of this process. So, we call for action to put this plan in place as soon as possible. Civil society, including African and people of African descent, need to play a crucial role in this development. Subsidies to anti-racism NGOs. We heard of the good practices that federal, regional, and local government give specific direct subsidies to organizations to fight against racism and that work directly in affected communities. However, we heard criticisms regarding how the grants are allocated and that the support allocated is very limited. We encourage all governments to continue to provide direct support to this organization, including those representatives or working directly with the most affected communities. Now I give it to Tracie.
Thank you, Victor. Another part of our mandate is about law enforcement. So during our visit, we did visit with law enforcement, and there are about 9 themes that I'm going to walk you through that came up during our visit. The first one is community policing. Policing reform took place in 2000 for not only Belgium but throughout the world, and the concept of community policing was very much a part of that. And during our visit, we witnessed some incredible examples of community policing, also known as proximity police here, with officers on footbeats, bicycles, walking and riding through communities, and really learning who is in the community. However, we also were told by community members that there used to be police stations in their neighborhood that put police officers in proximity with the community. And the reason why that is so important is because it does impact the relationships and the ability to build trust between law enforcement and those that they serve, specifically those of African and African descent. Now, they only see police officers when they are called or when they're on an operation, leading to a lack of relationship and a lack of trust. The next theme, racial profiling. Before and during the visit, the mechanism heard numerous stories about racial profiling and its widespread practice. In some neighborhoods, in particular, people who are not perceived as Belgian are the ones that are stopped the most. And those are usually young men of North African and Sub-Saharan African origin. And they seem to be disproportionately targeted. Another piece of this conversation around racial profiling is now calling it professional profiling. So there's a change of the name. Changing the name does not diminish the experience that occurs when you are being stopped and you're not being explained why that stop is happening. So following the law in order to make those stops has got to be paramount. And these types of stops also increase the profound mistrust of law enforcement between the communities and the communities that they serve. And it erodes the relationships and law enforcement's effectiveness. Excessive use of force. The mechanism also heard of cases of excessive use of force by police against African and those of African descent, including children. The fact recently reported by the General Delegate of the Rights of the Child that all of the 20 cases of police violence against children that have been reported to him concerned children of foreign origin. That is a worry for us, and it's a worry for the community. And of course, the most heartbreaking example we have is the killing of the 12-year-old last week when the police were chasing him with a patrol car while he was riding an electric scooter. And we also heard concerning cases of racialized children being detained with excessive force, as if they were adults. And scientifically, that is a phenomenon where you see young men of color, specifically those of African and African descent, are aged up. So they don't get to enjoy their childhood, they are seen as a threat or even as an adult. When this happens, it really does erode the trust between law enforcement and the community that they should be serving. But we also know that the violence has a disproportionality against this particular community. We also know that narratives, historical narratives of African Americans having exaggerated strength and the physicality of it also feeds into the perception of the need for the excessive use of force. Training for law enforcement officers. The mechanism was just to stress the importance of training law enforcement officers, not only in anti-racial discrimination, racial bias, and racial profiling, but in regards to the communities themselves and their origin story of how they arrived in Belgium. We also make sure that this is done through an intersectional lens. That means if you hold more than one identity, African descendant, woman, with her sexuality, and being of African descent, that means that you're going to have to look at all of the possibilities for the approaches that should be taken in consideration when you are engaging with the community. We heard of the Holocaust Police Museum and that relationship that it has with the Belgian police in training its members. We are suggesting that the same type of interactions and studies and training be done with the African Museum as well. We have two different stories and two different lived experiences, and it's important that each of those have its own space, and that we believe it should be mandatory not just in the recruit level, but for all who are wearing the uniform. We also heard that many police officers come to work in Brussels or from small towns and non-urban areas, and they lack the experience or even the understanding of diversity and the local dynamics. Considering the counts of racial profiling and excessive use of force, we all received the call for more anti-racial discrimination and racial bias training. We also have to add to that the techniques of de-escalation. Both the police academy and current officers, or what we say in service, are in need of that training. It should be ongoing, not just in the academy, but through the career. I must lift up this next theme of wellness for police officers. Police officers are challenged with very difficult situations. And oftentimes, these situations, much like community, leaves them traumatized. It's imperative that they receive the resources needed for their mental health and their physical health. Whether it's peer support, whether it's a designated group that offers mental health, it is imperative that those officers and all officers are taken care of in this space. The next theme is participation and belonging, and a lot of folks will think of this as inclusion. But it's important that the police reflect the composition of the population they serve. We heard from some efforts to increase diversity within law enforcement. There's still a lack of representation of people of foreign origin in the police, including those of African and African descent. It's particularly relevant for highly diverse cities like Brussels, where in some neighborhoods, the quasi-totality of that population is of foreign origin. The presence of officers of different racial and ethnic backgrounds within police are also key in improving trust in the community. During our visits, we met with officers of African and African descent who are very much proud to be Belgian and to be of service, but they also shared stories of hurdles placed in way, community members who still could not see them as human, although they're wearing a uniform. So we really encourage that the organizations that are providing service to foreigners, to those of African descent, have to reflect that community. Oversight. Oversight of police forces is an essential element of supporting the detection and prevention of any police misbehavior, including racial profiling. During the visit, we learned about the work of Keesee, the General Inspector of the Federal and Local Police, and how the responsibilities are divided between those two bodies. We consider good practice to establish a specialized watchdog outside of the executive power. We also welcome the fact that causes of death are dealt with by Keesee and not by the General Inspector. While the cooperation between the two entities appear to be good, a unified police database to harmonize the processing of complaints between the two entities would further improve this cooperation and the effectiveness of oversight work. We would also like to highlight the new competency of Keesee to receive whistleblower complaints. It is a good practice and it should be encouraged. In addition to that, whistleblowers will require specific protections, and we also recommend that those are examined and put into place. The extra mechanism was just to stress that real independence and impartiality are crucial, but so is the perception of independence and impartiality. In this regard, both Committee P and the General Inspector lack this perception of independence and impartiality among affected individuals in the community. The mechanism encourages Belgium to take steps toward fully an independent police oversight body, where members of the affected community are members of that oversight body. Complaints against police. We heard most complaints against police are dismissed. Sometimes for technical reasons, and then sometimes for opportunistic reasons. Moreover, the victims of police violence are often afraid of going to the police and complaining. It is even more the case for those of undocumented migrants. As an example, we heard the case of a woman of African descent who went to the police to report domestic violence and was asked about her immigration status as a first step to file a complaint. We want to stress that the low level of complaints make the issue of racialized violence by law enforcement less visible. Identification. The mechanism also learned that police officers have to wear badges to display their names, and they must have an identification number. However, oftentimes their identification details are covered by an enormous amount of equipment that they're wearing. Particularly when we are having engagements or large-scale events, it makes it very difficult for people to see the badge. So we are saying a good practice of that is to get a Velcro or removable nameplate that can be adjusted and moved. We also encourage, when asked, that the officers give their name, their true name. And so that is also a good practice. And finally, body-worn cameras. We learned that the use of body-worn cameras by law enforcement officers is not systematic, nor is it compulsory. Officers who wear such cameras can decide whether or not to activate them. And the mechanism recommends that there should be a mandatory and systematic use of body-worn cameras. There needs to be policies that are designed on when officers activate those cameras. There also needs to be policy that surrounds the retention of the video. But oftentimes, the use of body-worn cameras protects not only the community, but the officers themselves.
Now we're finishing with the criminal justice system. The criminal detention. There is an overrepresentation of people of foreign origin in detention centers. It is notable as consequences of racial profiling leading to the over-policing of people perceived as foreigners, including people of African descent. In addition, the migration status of defendants influenced decisions to place them in pretrial detention instead of any such alternative to the detention. Overcrowding rates are critically high in Belgian prisons, with a significant impact on the conditions of detention and therefore on human rights of detainees. One of the causes of this overpopulation is the increased number of people in pretrial detention. We were informed that over 96% of detainees are male. However, women in detention are perceived more harshly, and among them, women of African descent are particularly affected by negative stereotypes. We heard testimony of some women of African who had their children taken away from them because they were facing a criminal process. A large proportion of people with mental health conditions are placed in prisons due to lack of capacity in specialized mental health institutions. We would like to emphasize that prisons are not a solution, as adequate medical care cannot be provided there. Access to justice. There is a perception amongst racialized communities of a two-speed justice system, which is a bias against them. Lawyers are expensive and have no expertise in human rights, social justice, or resistance. We heard from affected communities and individuals that it is common for lawyers to suggest dropping the resistance arguments because it does not help the overall strategy of the case. All criminal justice actors, including prosecutors, lawyers, judges, magistrates, defenders, need to be trained in systematic resistance in the legacies of colonialism. Finally, in terms of the application of international treaties and human rights standards, the OPCA ratifications, the OPCA is the optional protocols to prevent torture of the United Nations. It's these mechanisms welcomes the express willingness of the government to ratify the optional protocol, a key instrument to prevent torture or infringement in places of deprivation of liberty. We also welcome the designation of the Federal Institute for the Protection and Promotion of Human Rights as the prevention mechanisms at the federal level. Regional and local prevention mechanisms need to be established as soon as possible, and adequate resources should be provided to all of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez and Dr. Keesee, for these findings and recommendations. I'd like to hand over to the journalists in the room to see if there's any questions. As mentioned, please name your media outlet and introduce yourself. And I also want to mention that there's interpretation available if you want to ask a question in French.
Govan Santos, I work for Namur, it's a newspaper, a French newspaper. I have one question. Our security minister, Bernard Quentin, said there was no such thing as systemic violence from the police forces here in Belgium.
We do that a lot.
Do you disagree with the Belgian minister?
Pardon, je crois qu'il va falloir. Ils ont été distraits par le fait que. Si vous pouviez répéter, s'il vous plaît.
Je répète en français, en anglais.
Si vous voulez, oui.
Our security minister, Bernard Quentin, I think you met him. He said there was no such thing as systemic violence in the Belgian police. Do you disagree or do you agree with him?
Would you like to address the question?
I can address the question. If you have systemic racism, you will also have forms of systemic violence. And the purpose of our visit is to bring to the table the experiences of those of African descent who have engaged with law enforcement for quite some time. And I think what we really need to talk about here is what kinds of things should we be focusing on in order to reduce the violence. And so when we talk about excessive use of force, we talk about do we de-escalate, how do we mediate, and these are things that will help with those systematic issues, or systemic issues that are often related to race. We also have to go back to officer training, because as you look at officers who do not have a history or understand the history of those they serve, as a former police officer, we can interpret things to be a threat when they are not. And so it is important not only to deal with each of these systems that are in play, but to begin to understand what are the things we need to do to reduce.
Any more questions?
I'm Tim Poesmans, working for the Belgian news agency Belga. I was wondering, well, it's all focused on discrimination against people of African descent. Why not, isn't it that you make it broader to other communities who are also facing discrimination, racism?
There are several ways to discrimination and racism, and one of them is the denied recognition of the issue as an important topic in the different levels of the institution, of the society, the past, political victims, and the general populations. Denial or invisibilization of racism is starting to fight by trying to change changing the culture using all kinds of measures like culture, museums, the colonialisms, and the idea is trying to identify plans, policies, transform actions, including a holistic way to combat struggle in the whole different phases to struggle systematic resistance.
Anything you'd like to add?
If I could, to your question, why is it broader? Those of African descent have a very long history with law enforcement that really ebbs and flows, but particularly has one in which there are encounters that are not just violent, but in some cases deadly. When you're working with this process, and I should also say that when you are looking at the experiences of those of African descent, whatever changes that are made to the system not only benefits them, but benefits everybody else. It is something that we are always aware of. So for example, if we talk about domestic violence and when do you provide services, if you are also providing services to one, you should be providing services to everyone. And so we always believe, and I believe, that when you are trying to make corrections and trying to support the work of officers, when officers treat the community well, everybody's treated well.
Thank you. Any more questions, please? No? There's no final questions? I would like everyone here in the room for attending, and especially the experts here for sharing their findings and thoughts.
Sorry, I'm Willie. I'm from the African show. Was wondering, as your experience, what would be a best practice in officers training towards alleviating the systemic profiling of people with African descent?
When we talk about best practices, we want to be careful because we don't want them to practice. We want them to get it. And there are a couple of ways in which that can be done. We mentioned that you can use the African Museum to bring officers in so they can understand the histories of those who live here. You also want to make sure that training is evidence-based, that it works. If it does not, then you go back and review, and you do that as well. Best practice also includes the community. Having the community come in to the academy and to speak to officers about their experiences and history as well. The other part of training that we know really does give an effect is that you must have scenario-based training. And for those of you who may not know, in the academy, when you're learning how to do your job as an officer, there should be scenarios where you will be able to then apply what you learn. And scenario-based learning also allows to have community brought in to be either actors or to monitor and watch. But it is a way for officers to understand what's expected of them. The reality is that oftentimes officers don't really understand it until they're on the street. So having field training officers that understand it, having strong supervisors who can help monitor, all of those things are put together in what we consider to be best practices. But I also add that Belgium, Brussels, they're all going to have to look at their communities and determine what works best for them.
As best practices of training in the police or any other institutions, I think there is a complementary approach between learning process, training, and sensibilize about the topic. I put in the top first, sensibilize about the topic to change to understand, and then the training must focus in methodology. And we learn a lot from Latin American police's training process, playing roles of the police officer, for example, putting in the shoes of the audience. The keywords is I'm the other, the difference in terms of we are trying to train, for example, with disabled people or African people and so on. So, changing the role of the police officer as a victim of resistance in different scenarios is the best way to train it and train the training process. I think this is the correct methodology.
Thank you very much. Any final questions before we close? I just wanted to mention, you said that the press release this morning as well. If there's any follow-up questions, do let us know. To reach out to us. And thank you again, the experts for coming, for sharing their expertise, and thank you as well